You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Sabah al-Khair, good morning dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni and Yusuf Ahmed al-Rimawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Good morning, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Palestine Remembered, day 322 of the ongoing genocide, day 322 of Western complicity, day 322 of Western silence and misery for the Palestinians. But we're uplifted by the actions of so many people in solidarity with the Palestinian people. That's the University of New South Wales and University of Melbourne, NTEU branches, both overwhelmingly passed resolutions that were in solidarity with the Palestinian people, calling for divestment from companies that are involved in the weapons manufacturers or any sort of supply chain activity, ending relationships with Israeli universities, signing on to the academic boycotts and divestment campaign against Israeli academic institutions and Israeli academics. Really beautiful and brilliant solidarity. I know the numbers in Melbourne, the University of Melbourne, was 97% of those that attended the meeting voted in favour of all of those divestment stuff. Not one person spoke against, which is a brilliant thing. This morning I'm joined by one of our brilliant young Palestinian women, activists, leaders, organisers, Miss Mai Saif. Good morning, Mai.
Good morning, Nasser. Thank you for having me.
A pleasure to have you on, Mai. A pleasure. Now, this is the first time you've been on the show. In a couple of minutes, can you share with our listeners your Nakba story? How did you end up in this colony?
Well, I'm actually a Palestinian woman born in the West Bank, in an area called Dulkaram. And my family never actually intended to come to Australia. But for many of us, it wasn't really an option. It was during the First Intifada. We had our family, a few of us had been killed, a few uncles had disappeared, and my parents decided that they needed to find a place that was safe for us. There was an incident where my brother, who at the time was just over a year old, a year and a half, and I was a newborn infant, around 3 months, and Israeli soldiers had shot tear gas into our house. And my mum was very, very quick on her feet and made sure to get onions and got us out into safety. It wasn't very safe, but we survived that. And for a newborn, that was quite dangerous. And from there, they decided that as there's escalating tensions, they would find a safe place to go.
And was the process as simple as, hey, Australia, take us?
No. It's actually quite interesting. My father happens to speak multiple languages, 7 languages.
So when it's 7, you don't say multiple, you say my father, the polymath, speaks 7 languages. Yeah.
And he would, to translate for a friend, he was getting to know a young woman who happened to speak English. He went to translate for a friend and he ran into an Australian man at the hotel and they got to chatting and turns out he had a business and he said, you know what, meet me at the embassy the next day. I think I've got a job for you. And he did. And it turned out he didn't need to sponsor my dad. They were looking for people with experience that my father had in the industry. And so he was able to get a working visa to come over and bring us over.
Imagine
and that happened very, very quickly.
Yeah, imagine that in Australia that, looks at talent, looks at people, and doesn't say Palestinian equals terrorist, unlike the conversation we've had for the past couple of weeks.
It's been, Peter Dutton has been racist fear-mongering. It doesn't look at us as human beings. It looks at us as some monolithic people that we've consistently been targeted and paintbrushed as terrorists. I even have my own experiences in high school being told that I can't be your friend because you're a terrorist. Consistently, Palestinians are othered and ostracized in society. And it's very interesting because a lot of people can't tell they can't tell you're a Palestinian when you meet people. They see a person. And so quite a lot of Palestinians are really educated. We're very ambitious. We're very strong contributors to our communities and our workplaces. And sometimes you see the look of shock on their face when you say you're Palestinian, because the racism and the propaganda is so pervasive.
Yeah, and you break down that stereotype. And Palestinians come in every colour. I remember I was in Palestine maybe a decade or more ago, and I was in a line with one of my cousins, and there was a red-headed guy behind me with freckles. And I sort of said to him, I said, look, just be careful. There's one of them. The enemy is behind us. And he turned around and he said, that's your cousin. And I went, what? There's like a village that, they're red-headed, like they should be called Hamish McLaughlin.
What's hilarious is that's my cousins. I happen to be quite fair-haired, green-eyed, really white, that look pretty Aussie. But my auntie, my cousins, they're all redheads with freckles. My grandma was a redhead with freckles. Yeah. And we never quite know when Oranga will pop out of us. Yeah.
But I mean, like this is the thing about, that land when they talk about the number of conquests and reconquests and what actually happened to the indigenous people. Yeah. The people that were there forever, that have been there forever. We're a mix of things. Like I'm the absolute opposite of May, dark and swarthy. I've got a brother with green eyes and fair skin. His daughter was born with blue eyes and fair hair. Yeah. To be Palestinian is to be all of those things. But also, I've got a cousin who's really, really quite dark, and we've got African Palestinians. Palestinians who are black.
Yeah, yeah.
We embody all of the beauty of Earth, which is why, when we say, a free Palestine frees the world. So our work is so important. May, you've been around forever. May keeps reminding me every now and again just how old I am by telling me that she came to my wedding 25 years ago as a kid. But she's been at every one of our protests and rallies, and you do brilliant work, May. Tell us a little bit about Free Palestine Melbourne, and we want to get to how people can be involved, and because people are looking for things to do. So Free Palestine Melbourne to where we are today.
Yeah, well, Free Palestine Melbourne is a not-for-profit organisation that we established, I think, 5 years ago, and it is an open group. It is for anyone who wants to advocate and campaign for Palestine. We started off with organising protests for Palestine. I should preface this by I look much younger than I am, and I've been organising protests here in Melbourne for Palestine since 2007. But we've always done it based on this idea of freedom and justice and liberation for the Palestinian people. It's about educating people about Palestine. So please get involved. We run education sessions around Palestine, about questions around genocide, apartheid, what is BDS. We work with lots of different groups and organisations, whether they're grassroots or bigger organisations in universities and even students. Anyone who wants to learn about Palestine and advocate and campaign. We believe in human rights. We believe in the idea that every single one of us deserves equality and justice, and that Palestinian people in particular have been the historical targets and the current targets of those rights being stripped away at them in a very violent way. And so it's about educating around what is happening in Palestine, what it means to be Palestinian. I think people in the mainstream world don't quite understand that, and that is that we're built and educated around justice, about equality, and about learning what it is to fight and resist and what is our resistance stories, because I think a lot of people don't know that Palestinians have been resisting for over 100 years against any forms of oppression, but in particular we've had all types of forms of resistance, and it's about learning those stories in our history and what you can do here in Melbourne.
Yeah, our brilliant podcast producer Michaela will be putting the podcast together a bit later, and he'll put a link to Free Palestine Melbourne's website so people can go on there and sign up to the newsletter, find out details about your monthly meetings and how they can come along.
We have an Instagram page called Free Palestine Melbourne. We have a website, so jump on there. You can contact us on Facebook. We have a monthly meeting that's open to anyone who wants to come along and learn. We have all of our events advertised on our social media pages.
You're running a couple of campaigns. Let's first talk about Thursday. We've got Saree Makdisi. He'll be launching his book, but also speaking with Louise Adler, Denial in the Time of Genocide. That's on Thursday. We'll put a link to that so you can buy your tickets for Thursday night. May and I will be there, but Louise Adler will be chairing that with Saree Makdisi.
And it's extremely important that we actually talk about this, because at the moment the Palestinian people are experiencing a genocide, and what we're seeing in our mainstream media and by our politicians is complete disregard of this. The state of Israel has not been sanctioned. There has been no criticisms made of it. There's been no embargoes. And in fact, the narrative of saying that there is a genocide is completely disregarded in our media. And it's really important that we talk about this genocide and what does this mean, and also what is our responsibility as Australians who are signatories to the United Nations Human Rights Convention and have an obligation to take a stance against any state that is committing genocide.
Mm-mm. I mean, this is one of the challenges with genocide. It's such a big thing, and it's a big charge, and it's the crime of crimes. At some point in the future, when all the evidence is gathered and all of the silks and wigs all sit at The Hague and they'll go, yes, this, and they said that, and then they did this, it's undisputable that at some point it'll be ruled a genocide, and it'll be in the rearview mirror. It'll be 5, 6, 7, perhaps 8 years away. It took almost 8 years for the Bosnian genocide and Rwandan genocide to be called genocides. They weren't called genocides at the time. The difference this time is that it's live streamed. People are watching it in the palm of their hands. The amount of evidence. I mean, the Israelis are not being shy. I just want to quickly just finish on this topic with respect to Saree. The really sickening thing, and this is the opening line of the event, is how can a settler colonial state rooted in violence and dispossession present itself as a progressive democracy? The great lie, they say, is that the devil convinced people he's not real. The second biggest lie is how Israel convinced the world that it's a progressive democracy and not the scumbag, settler, colonial, racist, genocidal state that it actually is.
Yeah, it's by othering us and our stories. It's a denial that we're an Indigenous population. That, in fact, it's really important that the narrative that this is a settler colonial state rooted in violence and massacres and ethnic cleansing has entered into the, I would say, the public space, because that's something that was not even acknowledged, let alone spoken about. And that the fact that Palestinians have actually been resisting and trying to fight for their homes and their families. Israel is an extremely violent state. It's also an apartheid regime. We've been calling it an apartheid regime for decades, but finally the international community in 2021 released, Amnesty International released a dossier around, in fact, Israel is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. And in the way that they're doing it, it is extremely violent and oppressive. It polices and murders and arrests civilian populations and children. They don't discriminate whether you're a child or a woman or a man. Everyone is a target. And so it's extremely important this is entered into the public narrative, because it was completely denied before. And it's really up to us, all of us, to talk about it, to educate more people about it and hold our politicians to account, because they are aware. They are aware of this, and they have chosen to align themselves with a state that is committing genocide, that is an apartheid regime and a settler colonial project.
Stay locked to 3CR.
How can a settler colonial state, rooted in violence and dispossession, present itself as a progressive democracy? Despite undeniable evidence of systemic racism and discrimination, Israel continues to launder its image with rainbow flags, forests planted over the ruins of destroyed villages, and a museum of tolerance built atop a historic 1400-year-old Palestinian cemetery. Join Professor Saree Makdisi and Louise Adler as they discuss how a false narrative of tolerance, coupled with a deep culture of denial, sustains the image of a liberal and multicultural Israel, even as it commits genocide against its indigenous Palestinian population. After the discussion, Professor Makdisi will be available to sign copies of his latest book, Tolerance is a Wasteland, which will be on sale. Denial in a Time of Genocide. Thursday, the 29th of August, 6 p.m, RMIT Building 80, 445 Swanston Street in the city. Head to humanitix.com and search for Denial in a Time of Genocide to book your tickets. Free Palestine Melbourne is a 3CR supporter.
At some point in the future, we call the PEPs, the progressive except for Palestine. They're great on Indigenous stuff, great on queer stuff, great on gender stuff, but Palestine, I'm not so sure. Case in point, there was a Jason Gilham, the MSO, the pianist that was cancelled from the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. He did a Late Night Live, the old radio show, and like the whole interview for an hour was really quite polite about, just how brave it was for Jason to stand up and, say like a minute monologue to talk about the targeted assassination of Palestinian journalists by the Israeli military. And, the question then becomes killed. They not question, but the language gets framed by the ABC as killed, they died. No, they didn't die.
They were murdered.
They were murdered. And at some point, these progressives, except for Palestine, are going to come to us and go, well, it was kind of hard, and are going to look for forgiveness from us. And as Martin Luther King said, we'll forgive our enemies, but not the silence of our friends. So all of you staunch Palestinian supporters who listen to the Australia's #1 Palestine show, mate, this is no little thing. It's Australia's only Palestine show, but it's the #1 Palestine show. We're not going to create space for these progressives who didn't stand up for Palestine today, who won't.
If you can't stand up in the middle of a genocide, when can you stand up? I mean, there comes a point where you have to stand by your basic humanity and your convictions. It is being live streamed in front of our eyes. We are seeing families gather the remains, the bits of flesh of their children. There are whole families completely wiped off the register. I've lost 11 family members, and that's relatively quite small that I know of, to be honest. My family in Rafah are now in tents. They've lost their homes. I have a friend, Muhammad, who has lost 75 family members in the most brutal way. I have cousins in Israel's prison systems right now, and our families have not been able to visit them. And when they're coming out, they're completely broken and destroyed, tortured. If you are seeing those images, how can you not speak out? And this is a real testament, because the Israel lobby is very, very aggressive. It does come after people, but it's actually us standing united together and saying, no, we actually need to speak back and push back, is when we're the most effective. It's not now that we need to be quiet. It's now that we actually need to speak up, because there are literal people who are dying and being massacred that need us to speak up. Their deaths cannot be in vain. And it's not a death. It's a massacre. They are being murdered.
It's a slaughter. I mean, when people are weighing bits of body to say that's roughly the weight of a child that you've lost, because the bodies are so unidentifiable, the weaponry that Israel's using is, just mincing human beings. We have to be pushing back, and it works. I mean, have a look. At the Sydney Festival last year, who took $20,000 worth of Israeli sponsorship money, and the magnificent efforts of crew that organised the boycott, divestment and sanctions of that event. Nobody's going to be taking Israeli embassy money anymore. I heard that there was a scout group in Wonthaggi that declined $1,000 sponsorship from the Israeli embassy. I'm just making that up. The joke isn't playing out very well in the studio here. So nobody's going to take Israeli embassy sponsorship money, but also have a look at the MSO. Within a couple of days, apologised. We had an act... Cat Empire, I think, or Red Empire, said, they're cancelling their shows in solidarity. The orchestra themselves put together a letter of no confidence. The board has ordered an external evaluation of the CEO and the operations manager. Standing up for Palestine is good. It works. Now, May, you and I have been around at the protest long enough to see the movement and growing understanding of our people, Australian Palestinians, and their understanding of the intersectionality, the connectedness of so many of our struggles. Do you want to talk about that evolution and where we are today?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important to talk about because I just want to quickly acknowledge that our Indigenous brothers and sisters here in Australia who've also experienced their own genocide and ethnic cleansing and settler colonial state have always stood staunchly with us. And that's extremely important because we need to talk about that connection between Indigenous struggles and Indigenous people around the world. But in particular, Palestine ties a lot of areas. So, for example, we had a focus, one of our protests, around women's rights. And some people go, well, why? And well, let's talk about it. Palestinian women are oppressed under the Israeli state. We're seeing women right now who can't even have babies in hospitals. They're completely being decimated and bombed. Looking at the West Bank, you've got women who don't have rights. They're languishing in Israeli prisons right now without any charges. You've got women who are dying on checkpoints because they couldn't get to a hospital. My mother in particular had me in an hour and they had to rush her out because during the First Intifada, and they couldn't treat her. They just got her in and out because there were too many wounded bodies coming through. Women are affected. We talk about disability, right? The intersection of our disability communities and vulnerable community. I care about that because that's where I really work. I work with some vulnerable communities. And you look at Palestinians disproportionately acquire disabilities because of the occupation. People don't realise that the loss of limbs for Palestinians is not a new experience. Israel has policies of shoot to maim, where you would have peaceful protests and they would shoot so that you could lose a limb. They would use specific bullets that would explode on impact, that you would lose an arm or a leg, particularly legs. So there are a lot of intersections here. There's intersectionalities around refugee rights. This is extremely important to talk about, especially in the context of Peter Dutton's racist fear-mongering around allowing Palestinians to come into Australia. Refugees, disproportionately, there were a lot of Palestinians who spent decades in Nauru, in detention centres because they had nowhere to go. They were persecuted in every place that they went. There are so many intersections of the cause with every element, and it's extremely important because Palestinian fight for recognition and justice and equality ties all these different struggles together because it affects every Palestinian in different ways. There is a combined struggle. Whether if you are fighting for queer rights, you're going to find connection here in a Palestinian struggle. And people are starting to learn that. And we're seeing it on the streets of Melbourne every week, where we're seeing union groups, community groups, we're seeing different campaign groups. Let's talk about, climate change groups. Israel has bombed Gaza and has dropped, tons worth, apparently, nuclear weapons tons worth on Gaza. But the destruction of our ecology through the occupation is a climate change issue. So there are so many intersections that when you look at Palestine, you see it. And the more you learn about it, the more you know that actually we need to stand for Palestine, because standing for Palestine means you stand for every single person who is oppressed and every other cause as well.
Indeed. We had Dr. Mazen Kumsiye on the show, and I remember him talking about, just how small Palestine is, but just how diverse the flora and fauna is. There are more indigenous flora species in Palestine than in the entire United Kingdom, but they're under massive threat. because what settler colonialists do when they settle a land is they try and make it look like where they came from. And so it's, white colonialists here bringing elm trees and oak trees because, that belongs. But it's also like Israelis planting eucalypts and pine trees trying to turn Palestine into Austria or Australia. Yeah. And those acidic leaves, etc., what it does to the indigenous land.
Yeah, and destroying it. I mean, we've got family now lands near, it's called Zawiya. The Israelis in 2006 took it away from us. 2010, part of the apartheid wall, and they completely removed a whole hill and every single native olive tree on there that went back to over 1,000 years old. In particular, one tree which was part of a Palestinian culture. When you're born, you are given a tree, an olive tree. My brother's tree was gifted to him by my grandfather, older than Jesus, and that was uprooted and destroyed, and a settlement is being constructed on that land. Complete destruction of our agricultural land as well.
And coming back to the talk with Saree, Makdisi and Louise Adler on Thursday, so make sure you go to the podcast and buy a ticket. There's a few tickets still left. Israel paints itself as this, beautiful place that cares about the environment, yet they're doing an ecocide in all of Palestine, but in particular in Gaza now. And the number you were looking for before May was 70,000 tons of TNT equivalent, so almost 5 Nagasaki bombs on Gaza.
On a civilian population.
In 10 months. And I mean, there used to be 2.3 million people trapped in 365 square kilometres. Almost 90% of those are now in something like 30 square kilometres, just jam-packed no humans ever lived like this.
Yeah. And let's think about the ramifications of that. They're being starved to death. There's no sanitation. There's no infrastructure. There's nothing. Every means of life has been destroyed. There's no clean water. There's no ability to grow anything.
Well, the first child just got diagnosed, has beyond diagnosed. We've got a few cases of polio in Gaza now, but a child is permanently crippled from polio in a disease.
The modern world.
Yeah. So the Israelis think that it can happen over there. Look at the barbarity of the apartheid. Israel is giving inoculations to their own soldiers for polio and the surrounding settlements, but not allowing the vaccines into Gaza.
Well, this is actually touches on something else, because I obviously have family in Gaza. During COVID, they provided expired vaccines, which, my sister happened to have to take and had a very poor reaction to. There wasn't... that's what they provided to the population, and they, as an occupying power, they had a responsibility to and an obligation under international law to vaccinate the Palestinian population. And what they did is they charged us and made us pay for expired vaccines. That's the level of depravity. They don't. And unfortunately, I think what people are starting to see is the Israeli state and its current politicians don't see us as human beings. They've said it to our faces. They've talked about rhetoric of wiping us out. I mean, I remember in 2018, there was 2018 or 2021, there was a famous T-shirt that the soldiers would wear of that said 1 shot, 2 kills, of a Palestinian woman, a pregnant Palestinian woman.
In the crosshairs
of
a sniper scope,
Yeah.
1 shot, 2 kills.
1 shot, 2 kills.
Shameful. May, thank you so very much for coming along. Friends, listeners, make sure you go to the podcast and get details of Free Palestine Melbourne's immense array of social media platforms, as well as their website. Sign up to the letter, get along to a meeting, find out what you can do. There's a lot of stuff going to be happening, in particular around wills. There's a campaign in wills there. Get along to Saree's talk with Louise Adler on Thursday. Tell your friends, share the podcast, and remember, there's never been a better time for a free Palestine.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast. If you found it valuable, please consider donating or subscribing to support independent community radio. To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au.